So 2018 was a really good reading year for me. As it stands currently on Goodreads, I have read about 30 books, and if all goes according to plan with the 2 readathons that I'm about to participate in, I will complete the year with about 40 books, so I'm very excited about that. But for now, I have read about 30 books. Quite a few of them I would consider to be some of my new favorite books of all time. And that is what this video is going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a rundown on my top favorite books of the year with quite a few honorable mentions thrown in. None of these books that I'm about to mention are rereads of mine, although I did give basically everything I reread a 4 to 5 stars. I'm not going to be talking about it in this video. All that aside, I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys, starting from my least favorite of my favorites to my absolute favorite of the year. So coming in at number 5, we have Stardust by Neil Gaiman. So this book I read for the Witchathon very recently, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. There was only just a little bit of me where I thought I wasn't enjoying it as much as I should, and that was towards the beginning. I had very high expectations for it at the very beginning because I am such a huge Neil Gaiman fan. I mean, he wrote my favorite book of all time, so I think I was a little harsh on it in the beginning, and it prevented me from really getting invested in it and reading it as much or as quickly as I would have liked, but by the end of it I really enjoyed it. As you can see, I tabbed it quite a lot, and I have all of my thoughts posted in the Witchathon vlog, so I will leave that linked somewhere if you want to hear more of my specific thoughts on it. This book is just kind of the fairy tale book that I needed. This year I've been really invested and interested in reading fantasy that was more fairy tale oriented as opposed to like high fantasy, which is very different from what I typically read. For whatever reason, this was the year of fairy tale fantasies, and Stardust definitely was like up there for me. So it follows a young boy named Tristan, and he lives in this town called Wall, and beyond the wall is like this fantasy world, and he's not really supposed to go there. And it follows the story of kind of how he was conceived, but also how he manages to find true love. And it's just really fun, it's really quirky, it's Neil Gaiman's writing, so there are a lot of jokes in there where you really have to like read them a couple times to appreciate the depth of the joke and like the depth of the word choice. It's one of my favorite things about him. His word choice is impeccable, and Stardust does not disappoint. So for number 4, we have Carville by Stephanie Garber. So Carville is a book that I rated a 4 out of 5 stars because I just didn't think that it was worthy of a full 5 stars because I didn't think the craftsmanship of it was like necessarily as good as that of Neil Gaiman. But my enjoyment level of it was so much higher, and for that reason it got a higher rating. But Carville really took me by surprise. I read about 2-3 chapters of it and hated it. I thought it was the worst book that I'd read that year. Despised it. I hated the way that it was told in like letters at the beginning, and I hated the family dynamic between Scarlett and her sister and her father. I just thought the entire thing was not very well written. No offense to Stephanie Garber because my opinion has totally changed, but the beginning of it I just did not like at all. I felt it was very cheesy and very formulaic, and then as I kept reading I was like, this is really addicting. Scarlett at the beginning I hated, but Scarlett at the end of the novel I absolutely loved. She's got one of the best character transformations I think in any recent YA book. I also just love the plotline of it. I love the fact that they go to this mysterious island and they participate in this carnival like mystery show and have to find out who was kidnapped and like what's happened to them. And I love the fact that it was the main character's sister that ends up being taken. It just adds like a closeness to the storyline, but even by itself, like if Scarlett was just going to figure out the mystery, I think that storyline would have been compelling enough. So I don't know, it really worked out. I love the whimsy of it. I love the fantasy elements of it as well as the dark, more horrific things. There are some things that I still have issues with, like there were a couple characters that were introduced that you thought were going to play a bigger part than they did, and as someone who's very character oriented, like I fall in love with characters very quickly. I didn't like the fact that I was introduced to a few characters that were given names that I was invested in that I just never saw again, but it's all made up for because Julian is like officially my book boyfriend. I think he is amazing. I love him. Precious. And I love him and Scarlett together as like a dynamic duo. I love the whole thing. The way it unravels was great, and it was entertaining, and the fact that it took me so by surprise really made me love it even more. So coming in at number 3, we have a book that I rated a full 5 out of 5 stars, and that is Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. I don't know how I made it this far in life without ever having read a Rick Riordan or Percy Jackson novel, but I finally got around to reading this. I listened to it on audio earlier in the year, and I fell in love with it. I read this during a period of time where my brother and his friends and I were all getting back into playing childhood games, so I remember logging on to Wizard 101 and talking to them while listening to this on audio, and it was just so fun. One of his friends loves this book series, so I was able to tell him like what I was reading and we could talk about it. If you don't know what Percy Jackson is about, I'm shocked but it is about Percy Jackson himself. He's the son of Poseidon, and his world kind of unravels as he figures that out, and he ends up going to this camp called Camp Half-Blood where he meets other demigods, and the story unravels from there. It's a lot darker than I thought it would be, which was interesting. It does have like childish jokes and like middle grade style humor, which I love, but it also has dark elements, which is my favorite type of middle grade to read, so I appreciated that. And I can definitely see why people are so obsessed with this. I'm very, very excited to continue on in the series. And like I said a second ago, I'm someone who gets very invested in characters, and this book does not disappoint when it comes to interesting characters. Even characters that I wasn't necessarily as invested in, I still remembered because they were painted so vividly by Rick Riordan, and I just loved that. I definitely think that Percy himself is my favorite character. Typically main characters aren't my favorite characters. I typically fall in love with like side characters for whatever reason, but for once we have a main character where I was like, this is it, he's my favorite. I also love the fact that Percy is really Slytherin, and this is the first time I recall reading a book where the main character is like so blatantly a Slytherin, and I really like that because typically when you get main characters, they are Gryffindor type characters. He was such a good main character. So coming in at my second favorite book of the year, we have a very recent read. In fact, it is the last book that I've read to completion, and that is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. I love this book, and like Carville, it was a book that I didn't like at first. When I first started reading it, I was like, wow, the writing is beautiful, but the storyline is very dull. It focused a lot on the family and different paths that the different characters took. I was really kind of hoping it would jump straight into fairy tale to begin with, which it doesn't, but it ended up working out in the end. Once I figured out why Catherine Arden was putting so much detail into where the other siblings went and the family dynamic, it really started to make more sense, and I really loved it for that reason. By the end of the novel, I was completely hooked. I was at work and all I could think about was how I thought the novel was going to end, and it just completely consumed my life. In fact, while at work, the day after I'd finished reading the novel, there was a fish that I contemplated buying for myself just so I could name it Vasya after the main character. And there's only ever been one other book series that I named a pet after, and that was Bisengast, so clearly this is high praise considering that's one of my favorite series of all time. But this book just completely caught me off guard, similarly to Carville, but way more impactfully than Carville. In a lot of ways, Vasya reminded me of myself when I was younger, and I think that I had some sort of like weird connection for that reason with this novel. Russian folklore is so interesting. I had heard a little bit about it from reading American Gods, but I'd never really gotten that deep into it, and I think it's maybe like one of the more interesting like folklore mythologies that I've ever really studied. That's another reason why I like it. I'm actually planning on reading the second book very soon, so I'm excited to jump into that. And then the third one I think comes out in 2019, so hopefully I can read the second book in the series in time to read the third one. I'm just so excited. It was so good. I just realized I never really explained what it's about. It is about a young girl named Vasya who is born with these, not really like abilities, but she's just born peculiarly, and it follows her throughout her life, and it also involves frost demons and like death spirits. And then my favorite character, I don't think he's really technically one character, I think he's kind of just like a conglomerate of characters, but he is the Domovoy. He's like this little spirit that lives in people's houses in their fireplaces, and you feed him bread and he keeps your home safe. I just want a Domovoy for my own home. So before we get to my first favorite book of the year, I'm going to talk about some honorable mentions. These are books that I loved, but not enough to consider them some of my favorites either of all time or of the year, but they're still books that at the time especially I was very in love with, and I'm just gonna rapid fire them. So first we have Saga Volume 8, You by Caroline Kepnes, Sun Underwood by Robert Haas, Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Nimona by Noelle Stevenson, The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, and finally, Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. So, as for my number one book of the year, that is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. This book I first read and rated a 4 out of 5 stars. I just thought that I liked it, but I can't stop thinking about this novel, and it's been months since I first read it. It follows a girl named Anidori who is a princess, and she is forced to leave her own home in order to go marry a prince from a neighboring kingdom, but on the way there, her group that she's traveling with is sabotaged, and she is framed and sent into hiding because if she comes out of hiding, she's going to be murdered, and someone has taken her place. That's all like at the very beginning of the novel. From there, you follow Anidori as she learns her powers, and the magic system in this novel is one of my favorite things about it. It's maybe my favorite magic system ever because it is all language based, and people have powers that allow them to speak to different species. It's called the Goose Girl because Anidori can speak to geese, but there are other characters in the book that have the power of people speech, so they are very eloquent and people really listen to them, and they're typically leaders because they are so good at charming these people into listening to them. And there are people that can speak to water and air and just everything. Like, everything has a language in this book, and people can harness that language and learn it, and that's what the magic is, and I love that about it. Another thing that I like so much about the Goose Girl is the characterization of Anidori herself. Out of all the characters that I've ever read in a fantasy like this, and like a fairy tale fantasy, she has the biggest character change, like the biggest character progression, and I love that. There's a slight romance in this novel that I also love. There are characters in this novel that you don't ever think you're going to get attached to, and then something bad happens to them and you realize how attached you are to them. It's just perfect for anyone who loves fantasy with whimsical features but also dark elements. Anyone who's like an English language nerd would like this as well, and anyone who likes novels that are character driven would definitely like this. Overall, it's just the best book that I read this year, and like I said, when I first read it, I just thought it was like okay, I just thought it was nice, but I just can't stop thinking about it, and the more I think about it, the more I realize that this is definitely the best, most entertaining, and most impactful book that I read this year, because it really left a mark on me. Alright, so those are my top books of the year. It was really hard to compile this list because I read so many great ones this year, and I'm very happy with the ones I have read. Hopefully by the time this goes up, I won't have read any that dethrone any of these other books. But if I do, then you will hear about it in like a December wrap up or something once the new year arrives. In the comments, let me know what your top book of the year was, or if you've posted a video like this, let me know in the comments so I can go watch it and see what your list was and see if we have any like coordinating books. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time I post a book video. Bye.